Jonathan Larsen, thank you so much for joining me on this. Is of my first of a series of conversations since 2020 for the Way with Anoa. So I'm really, really excited to have you as a part of my relaunch and just in time. There's so much going on right now. I mean, it's politics, it's news, it's America. There's always something going on, but you and I spoke recently about something that was really glaring and seems like the type of thing that the media should want to really amplify and highlight, particularly as Americans are in the process of making the choice of who is going to be our next president. But some recent reporting you did for your outlet, The Fucking News, love it, really amplifies a critical point in terms of like leadership, moments of crisis and how people respond. And so, there was some reporting previously done by the Politico talking about exchanges that then former President Trump had with Governor Jay Inslee. And there was something that was overlooked that relates to my home state of Georgia. And so we got to chatting and I was like, oh my God, we have to talk about this. So Jonathan, can you please just like kind of just set the stage kind of for what you're reporting, what you dug into, what you found? Why does this matter now?
Yeah, sure. Well, I certainly think that it's of interest to Georgia voters, at least some Georgia voters, I would guess. Politico did a great piece on how Trump, at the end of 2020, going into the start of 2021, sat on a request from, I don't know, September or earlier 2020 from Governor Jay Inslee, a Democrat in Washington, to make the federal disaster declaration for wildfires there that you need to unlock federal disaster aid. And way at the bottom of the story, which again, it's a fantastic story, there were quick little hits about similar seeming situation with much less detail given about a number of other states. Georgia got 3 paragraphs in relation to Tropical Storm Zeta, which hit in late October 2020, hitting central western Georgia, northern Georgia, counties, including Atlanta. And what Politico reported was that it took Trump 55 days to sign off on Governor Brian Kemp, Republicans' request to make that disaster declaration, which, as I said, frees up all the funds. So I got very curious, right? I was very curious now about what was the story there. There were other states that were hit by Zeta. What was their timeline? What was the internal timeline behind Kemp's process? And one of the things that struck me that I didn't get into enough in the story, but Kemp made the request, I believe it was November 18th, something like that. And, or maybe a little later, maybe a few days later. But there's no, as far as I can tell, there's no sign that he said so publicly, which to me is kind of fascinating, right? Just a storm, big storm hits, at least 3 people killed, $1 billion, it turns out, in estimated damages, almost 1 million people in Georgia without power, some of them for days. You would think the governor would want to let folks know in pretty rapid fashion, hey, I've asked that this disaster declaration be made so that we can get the funding we need. So I dug into the FEMA records a little bit, and it turned out that Alabama didn't finish. First, you have to finish a disaster assessment, right? You have to look with local, state, county officials, federal officials, and sort of judge what was the actual damage done here. That seems fair. That makes sense, right? But Georgia, it turned out, finished their damage assessment earlier than Alabama did. Alabama with Governor Kay Isley. Am I getting her name right? Ivy, I think. I'm embarrassed now. I forgot her name. But
Kay Ivy, you had it right.
Kay Ivy, thank you. So Trump, it turned out, signed off on their disaster declaration. I believe it was only 10 days later, in December of 2020. Georgia, for no apparent reason, didn't get signed off on until January 12th. And at that point, FEMA issued its press release. The White House issued their press release. All they said was Trump has signed off on it. And even the governor's office, their release didn't say anything about when Kemp had asked for it. It's only if you go into the actual FEMA documents that you see, and this is how Politico was able to make the calculation, that Kemp requested it on, I think it was November 18th, or that's when their disaster declaration was done, but it was around then, for a total of 55 days. And if anything, Georgia, as I mentioned, Georgia's disaster assessment was finished before Alabama's and may have had less damage than Alabama because it hit as a hurricane when it hit Louisiana and Mississippi. By the time it made it to Georgia, it was down to a tropical storm. So because of the way the calendar works and the nature of the linear space-time continuum, this was playing out, at least at the beginning, at exactly the same time that we know Trump was pressuring Georgia officials, including Kemp, to turn over the state's electoral college electors, which would hand him the 2020 presidential election illegally and dishonestly. And then, of course, once Kemp declined to do so and certified Biden as the winner, Trump reportedly then went off calling him a nut job and a moron, if I've got the particular epithets from that moment correct. So, and then apparently just had no motive at that point anymore to help Kemp. Now, maybe I'm overly reading into why the delay, but the fact that, like, it seems to me that people would want to know that Georgia finished their disaster assessment later than Kemp did and his officials did, and they got their funding much sooner. So that's probably not just the backstory, but the entire story, pretty much. As far as we know, Kemp hasn't commented.
Right. Well, and in following some of the different updates from the state, when there have been, I mean, recently it was announced that they're going to release some stipends, basically back to taxpayer rebates or refunds back to taxpayers based on the surplus we have, which even though those of us who pay attention to these things know that a good portion of that surplus is actually in due in part to ARPA, to the American Rescue Plan Act, that was passed almost immediately after President Biden and Democrats took control of the House and Congress. They will never acknowledge that. So it's not surprising that they would ever acknowledge that, despite the challenges that we've seen here that Kemp and Republicans who support Kemp have had with the former president, that they would ever acknowledge that, particularly now when we see in the aftermath of two really major hurricanes and some of the challenges happening with FEMA in terms of funding and the ability to really provide relief and funding to the states that have been impacted, parts of Georgia, but really we're looking at North Carolina. Florida has been hit really badly as well. Eastern Tennessee. So Jonathan, I'm just thinking about like just how the media is covering this type of stuff and like why this type of story. Again, this might just seem like, innocuous infighting, but this seems to speak to also the ability, because in moments of disaster, we need people to kind of work together, regardless of what their personal political aspirations or campaigns or whatever. From your vantage point, as someone who's been, an editor, a journalist for quite some time with a great long history, how does this read to you in terms of like when people are thinking about the choices they're making going forward and the ability of folks to lead with, I don't know, honesty and the people's interest in mind versus just their own self-interest?
Well, look, I think, I would like to think that were I in Kemp's position and the position of others in 2020, that I would have had the integrity to do what they did and certify the winner as the winner. So I don't want to judge that too harshly, but I guess as you mentioned, a longtime media person, there are two buckets of concerns here. One is, how did the elected leaders respond to this? And as you say, certainly in the case of a disaster where the difference of days in response might make the difference between someone being homeless or not, or who knows what, losing a business, whatever it might be. There are very salient, big life-changing moments that happen in the aftermath of a disaster like this, where time really is of the essence. And so you would certainly hope that you would hope that politics, partisan politics, I should say, as opposed to governing politics, partisan politics should never be a part of that process. And we should all be outraged if it is. So, but certainly in the case of a disaster, especially when even past Republican presidents, I think, have not had the kind of record of open pettiness and willingness. Like Trump made a lot of his threats pretty openly in COVID. He was talking about, well, they have to ask me nicely. No, not a thing. You are obliged to be president of all the people, regardless of whether some of their elected representatives don't kiss your ass. So that's one thing. The other thing that was kind of terrifying to me as someone in the media is this wasn't a massive national trauma that dominated headlines for quite a while, the way Helene and Milton did. But it was still a very real storm, especially for Georgia. And the idea that no one in the Georgia media, as far as I can tell, had, until Politico put it together, figured out the time frame. When did the governor ask for the declaration? Like, that's a fairly basic question in terms of covering disaster response. Have you asked? When did you put it in? Have you gotten an answer yet? No? Why not? Like, these are fairly standard things. So the idea that local media, state media included, either weren't asking or weren't getting answers to and making a stink about the lack of answers, that's troubling. It doesn't mean that they've done something ethically wrong. It could very well be a case of lack of resources. Either one of those scenarios is troubling, and people should be concerned about it, because in that space, that's where corruption and cronyism and partisan, stealing of democracy takes place. I was going to say democracy dies in darkness, but I don't think we say that anymore. Anyway, so that's my take on the sort of systematic democratic implications of what we're talking about here. And of course, the just to take a quick tangent, I apologize if you were going to get to this, Trump is out there accusing the Biden administration of doing exactly this, especially in, as you mentioned, North Carolina.
Yeah, no, I was going to get there. Like, so, and I appreciate you going there, because we do see right now, and we've seen a couple different ways this is happening with Trump and Trump allies, whether senators like Mitch McConnell or actual surrogates, making accusations towards the Biden-Harris administration, President Biden, or just various Democrats, that they're doing things that in fact Trump and his folks have are either doing now or have already done, right? And in this case, the playing favorites with disaster relief. And you're right, there's very clear specific process. It doesn't matter about whether I like you. It has nothing to do with that. It has to do with what people in this country need in moments of crisis. And so, just even when we look at like the reporting of some of these things, Jonathan, it just seems like there's a lot of back and forth, like tit for tat, like, well, they said that this is happening, or they said that this is happening, without a journalist really doing any of the real deep analysis. There's this ongoing conversation about objectivity, and, we got to be fair to both sides. But like, Jonathan, with your vantage point and experience, where actually, how are journalists, how are news outlets actually getting this maybe wrong with the reporting and the focus? And is that maybe leading to folks overlooking a simple question, like you said, when was a declaration requested, as if it's, a given? Are there things that are being looked because people just kind of have blinders on in a way?
Well, I think there's some element to that, but I also think it's worth celebrating the fact that Politico did this reporting in the first place. But I do think that the fact that none of this information was out there for 4 years after Zeta does suggest that, as you said, there's a lot of coverage of the back and forth. And it's kind of a hacky knock on journalists to call them stenographers, right? But to some extent, they should be. Like, we should have a record of what these people are saying. But my concern about journalism, as someone who's worked in print and digital and radio and TV, is that too much of it is being driven by the focus on just chronicling, which is a nicer word than stenography, chronicling what's going on now, right? as opposed to really thinking about what are the systemic issues at play here? How is the system serving or not serving the people? Not just in terms of the way it's supposed to by statute and tradition and all that, but also in terms of how the way it's written and the way the laws are and whether or not those are serving the people, right? So much of that is sort of taken at face value. And as someone who, as you said, has been doing this a long time, I think that's an unappreciated aspect of ageism in the industry, right? I think ageism a lot of times is associated with the real tendency to hire young, traditionally good-looking women and then sort of shuffle them off the stage once they no longer fit that, whatever the prevailing ideal is of the moment. But that's not just true on camera. Off camera, the people crafting the news we see and to some extent making decisions are people who are kind of invested in doing good, doing well in the job that they have as it's defined, right? And it takes a while to become crusty and crotchety and cranky and say, wait a minute, we're missing a bigger picture here. That's the kind of thing that comes with experience. I sort of feel like I had it from the get-go, but that just may be a character
so
flaw of mine.
You came into it crusty and crunchy.
I was pre-crusty. I'm pretty sure I was pre-crusty. But, as I now get to the other side of the crust fault line, I recognize, looking back, that some of the journalists who I worked with when I was young and they were older, like I appreciate now their crustitude, which at the time you sort of attribute to bitterness or what have you. And now you're like, oh, yeah. I get it. They've seen the system working and not working, and so they're dismissive and nihilistic about it. And that's a real problem because that means, for instance, that the vast majority of Georgia, which I suspect does not read the fucking news, doesn't know about this.
Right.
And this is a very close race in Georgia right now. And theoretically, a lot of those voters in northern Georgia, central western Georgia, would have pretty powerful memories of what went on in their communities, in their counties. And, some of them may have even had a stake in how soon and how much the federal aid was approved.
Yeah, and some of these same areas are areas that would have been impacted by Helene most recently. Milton, thankfully, did not land here, but yes, definitely. And just thinking about something you were saying about, just really thinking about, journalists and kind of our duty and our role, and you touched on this a little bit with the democracy dies in the darkness comment earlier, just kind of shifting a little bit to what we also saw happen last week. We had your reporting come out, we had political reporting, but last week we also saw the LA Times followed by Washington Post refuse to endorse in the presidential election. I think the LA Times, it was the first time since 1988 that this has occurred. And, people can go back and forth about whether or not newspapers, but editorial boards, this is something that is done. This is a part of what has been the regular pattern and practice for, major editorial boards across the country for decades at this point. But I think the real chilling effect more so is the fact that we have Jeff Bezos, billionaire owner of, I want to say Blue Steel, but I know that's a Zoolander reference, Amazon and Washington Post.
Right.
Seemingly unilaterally, without any explanation, even to his internal staff, just refusing to allow an endorsement to go forward. Just looking at everything you're saying about what we need in journalism and where we're trending towards, how does this type of control, this unilateral control over something like this, how does it actually impact the integrity of the journalism, of the reporting, of the news that is being given to people across the country, even as we have more and more being hidden behind paywalls? And independent journalists, we have to find a way to make a living, but these major outlets that have become like a primary source of information and fact finding for so many, it just seems like it does a disservice. But I wanted to get your take.
So how much time do you have? I mean, look, I think it's worth noting that I don't think we've heard, and I think this is a good thing. I don't think that we've heard signs that the guy who owns the LA Times or Jeff Bezos at Washington Post is putting their thumb on the reporting. That's a good thing. Now, the guy Bezos brought in to run the Washington Post, he appears to be a walking thumb, so Bezos doesn't have to do that, right? Personnel is policy. So I go back and forth on this a little bit. There is a problem conceptually, systematically, with the concept of billionaires. That's just a bad thing. It doesn't mean it's bad that someone can be very successful. It's bad that their success is not apportioned appropriately among the people who are actually responsible for it or the system in which it occurred. But on the other hand, sometimes, especially in the past, we used to have these folks who ran newspapers, and some of them were clearly awful, terrible people, and they would just print lies, write Hearst and yellow journalism and all that stuff. But some of them have also been crusaders, and they've been like the sole people to stand up for things or against things. And I'm pretty close to a First Amendment absolutist, and I'm not sure I see the remedy there. Short of saying people can't own newspapers, which is obviously problematic for lots of reasons. I do think that there was a missed opportunity in the 90s when the internet was becoming a thing, where the government, don't get me started on Bill Clinton, had an opportunity to look at this and be at least a little bit foresighted and say, this is going to be a game changer. This is going to, we're now getting a neural implant for the entire Homo sapiens, right? And this is going to change the way information moves within our society, how it's created, how it spreads, how it mutates, how it evolves. And there was an opportunity, I think, to create a space, a government public space that had the kind of firewalls that the Corporation for Public Broadcasting used to have. And, we have all kinds of, you're already seeing now, like a lot of the internet's lore and history is already gone. Like a lot of these websites are already gone. We sort of think of, oh, it's on the internet, so it'll be around forever. A huge proportion of things that were on the internet now are not. And it seems to me that, we've got great resources like the Wayback Machine and what have you, but it seems to me that we could have had something in place which in theory could have fostered a new kind of journalism. Excuse me, whether it's like, a nonprofit, hybrid or something, right? And I get that there's all kinds of potential problems because what happens to that body once Trump is in place? But just as with the Federal Reserve and other organizations, there are ways to politics-proof some of these things. And, it's not too late, and maybe Europe will come up with some answers. But I also think that as someone whose work has been ripped off by some of these, like what you call primary sources, right? Sometimes they're really just primary aggregators. And I do think there's actually potentially something really democratic, small d democratic, and hopeful about the rise of citizen journalists. The danger is, I think, whether or not the society in which those folks are operating now will reward painful, messy truth-telling or truth attempting, or whether they will reward warm, comforting, maybe not accurate spoon feeding. And my concern right now is that we're a little bit too far on the spoon feeding side. I get beat up at the fucking news on occasion. I don't mean to complain too much. Most news fuckers are great. But every once in a while, there's like, hey, don't discourage voting. It's like, you've come to a journalism site. We point out critiques when we think they are appropriate to the conversation. It doesn't mean we take shots to be quote unquote fair. It means if there's something that we think is important, we try to let people know. And as for editorials, just to get back to that, the analogy I always use is something like, when we go to a doctor, we want them to tell us, Jonathan, I have bad news, you have face cancer, whatever it might be, right? That's the job of the reporter part of the doctor. The editorial board part of the doctor is the part that says, we're going to have to amputate your face, right? You want the recommended solutions and remedies from the same body. It's very strange because we have that in just about every profession there is in the world. Plumber comes in. Oh, I see. You did something really bad in the toilet. That's your problem. Well, what should we do about it? You know what? I'm going to leave it to voters to make up their mind. Well, you're the expert. I called you here to fix it. What is it we're supposed to do? Doctors, home builders, handymen, landscaping guys, whatever it is, we expect not just to tell us about the problems, but based on the expertise that they presumably have that let them identify those problems, let us know, what does the best path forward look like? And even if they don't think that's their role for whatever reason, if they think that Kamala Harris or Donald Trump is the best way forward, it's not just a matter of telling us what to do, it's also a matter of disclosing, who are you? What do you bring to the table? What values do you see the world and our system through? That's a public service to let people know this is the value system. This is the worldview that is shaping our reporting, right? There's no such thing as objective reporting. Even if every single thing in a story is factually true, the decision to tell that story in the first place, let alone to put it on A1, that's a subjective decision. By definition, has to be, right? Everyone else will have their own opinions about what should be told in the news that day. So editorials are a way of owning that and saying, here are the subjective values that we bring to the table and that inform our editorial decision making. So I don't remember your question, but I'm sure I did a great job answering it.
I think you did as well. And then just as we're wrapping up, just thinking about, you were talking about just what's great in this moment, the rise of like citizen journalism. We have, all these different like modes that people are really building up. We have nonprofit outlets rising more, solidarity, movement aligned journalism, solutions journalism. I was just wondering like your thoughts as we close out this conversation on like, what are some things that people really need to like hone in on as they're honing this as a form of craft and not just spurlunking into a type of infotainment space, but really the value add as we look to see the filling in the gap from, the 200,000 people who cancel their Washington Post subscriptions, according to NPR, they're going to need someplace else to like share or go to. So what is the value add for folks who are looking to be a part or be the media that they should really be thinking about as we're doing this work?
So obviously, I think the number one thing for people to do is go to thefuckingnews.substack.com. That's obviously number one. But no, I think it's important for people to be sort of educated consumers, and that there are a few, I think, quick handy guidelines that people should have for that. One is don't rely on one source, and when you find yourself really invested in something and engaged in a subject, do some research on that goes beyond the news of the day, right? Most likely, whatever it is you're curious about, someone probably did a fairly boring, non-provocative study about it a month or so ago. It's useful to see what those things had to say as well. But I think, and that's fairly common, conventional wisdom, I think, have more than one source. But I also think it's really important, especially at a time where, for reasons that I think I understand, people are very admirably willing to protect themselves by saying, I'm not going to expose myself to toxicity. I think there's a really admirable kind of generational thing happening there that has a lot of value to it. But there's also a danger to it, which is that you might miss things that are true and that you don't like being true. And it's really important for the the set of things that we know as facts, not just to be the things that we're cool with, right? And so, one of the, I guess, controversial examples that I often turn to is, who are Trump supporters, right? There are racist Trump supporters. There are misogynistic Trump supporters. There are xenophobic, the whole list, theocratic. You can do all of that. There are also Trump supporters. It's a spectrum, right? And it's really dangerous to blind ourselves to what how did we get here? How is it that people who weren't practicing all of those toxic things, one Obama presidency ago, are doing it now, right? Germany wasn't full of Nazis before it was, and then very soon after World War II, it was pretty free of Nazis, right? It's not like these are core defining principles. So it's I think the danger in being overly determinative about things is that it blinds us to what's really going on and how do we get out of this mess. And that may mean, as with lots of issues, that may mean grappling with and not blinding ourselves to things that we don't like, but might have some factual basis to them.
Absolutely. I appreciate you so much, Jonathan Larsen, taking time to talk with me on The Way with Anoa today. Tell folks where they can read more, find more of your work, subscribe somewhere. Like, how can I get more of this intellectual, newsy goodness from you?
Well, thank you very much, and it's always a pleasure to connect with you. And I'm so grateful for all the work that you do. And you were one of the first people I thought of when I had this Georgia story in front of me. So I do a weekday morning newsletter called The Fucking News, thefuckingnews.substack.com. That's really mostly aggregation, and every once in a while it's things like, let's go look at these FEMA files and see what it says. I also have a Substack, jonathanlarsen.substack.com, which is pretty much exclusively just, I've talked to sources, I've done real, investigative or original enterprise reporting. And I've got some stories that I'm hoping to break, hopefully this week there, but I've got a list about half a dozen long. And obviously subscribing helps support that, becoming a paid subscriber, all of those things. Eventually, I would like it to be sustainable enough that, I don't have to, I'm sure you have the same thing. We don't want to nag people for money all the time. And it's like, once we get to a certain level, then we can shut up about the money.
Absolutely.
Which is the goal. But
we don't have a billionaire backing us, so here we are.
We do not. I haven't checked all of my paid subscribers yet, so as far as I'm aware, no, we do not. But I got to tell you, and I'm sure you see this too, like the number of people out there who will literally just say, here's some money. I don't want any extras. Yeah. I don't want the DVD director's commentary. I don't need any of that. It just means something to me that you are doing this, and I want to help you do it. Like, it's such a moving thing to have happen, and it happens, it happens all the time that I hear from people who say that. So there's something really lovely and powerful about connecting that directly with the people who are affected by and, responding to our work.
Absolutely amazing. Thank you, Jonathan. I really appreciate you for joining us.
Thank you.